Garry, thank you for talking to me. Could you please tell me about your own political involvement before the first Mardi Gras parade in 1978?
Yes, well that would go back to 1970 when a thing called Campaign Against Moral Persecution, was set up here in Sydney. It was definitely the first what we would call gay political activist group in Australia. And so we were involved in that. There were occasional demonstrations at various events. And after that, there was a sort of shift. Younger people turned to gay liberation. They felt the old stuff was a bit too conventional, so they were much more into zapping people and confronting people. So there was a psychiatrist who did aversion therapy, McConaughey. So there was often confrontations with him at the University of New South Wales or Prince Henry Hospital, where he often did his aversion therapy. So there were things like that. But also in the 70s, there were a whole range of other demos. The Vietnam War was over, but environmentalism, anti-nuclear stuff, saving the natural bushlands and stuff. So you got involved in a whole range of demonstrations. Some of the chants reflected this: stop police attacks on gays, women and blacks. So Indigenous rights, women's rights, things like that. So we were fairly, I shouldn't say hardened, but it had been involved, and so there was a lot of history of political activism going right through until 1978. And it started out, it was just, how were we to know that one would become history? It started out just like any other.
And of course, that first Mardi Gras parade wasn't an isolated parade. Earlier that day, there'd been a protest march. Yes. And a meeting at Paddington Town Hall. How was that organised?
I think that was actually organised either by Gay Lib or Gay Solidarity Group, GSG. There was overlapping memberships in these things. You might be a member of one and the other. And they all had their own slightly different agendas. But I think it was Gay Solidarity Group. We marched through the city in the morning doing the usual chants.
So you were there at the march?
Oh yes, I was there on that first one.
Do you remember any of those chants?
Oh yes, well, stop police attacks on gays, women and blacks, and gay is just as good as straight, 2468, gay is just as good as straight. Then we had the meeting up at Paddington Town Hall that afternoon. It was more about what should we do in the future, various other things. And I can't remember who it was, said we just have to do a parade or something down Oxford Street just to have a more of a fun ending for the day.
And the parade began at Taylor Square around 10:30?
Well, we got up there about 10. I think it was probably about 10:30 when it started. They had the truck, Lance Gallen was driving.
It was just the one truck,
One truck in those days, yes, a very minimalist Mardi Gras. And Lance was driving. I think we had the music on the back. There might have been an expectation that when we got to Hyde Park and there was talk, there might have been a singer. Margaret Rodenite often came along and sang at various of these events afterwards. And 10:30 we started off marching down the street, and the chant that night was out of the bars and into the streets, because at that time Oxford Street was just full of gay bars. Tropicana, Flo's Palace, the Oxford Hotel, down the bottom was Patches, the Exchange Hotel had one bar there. There was so much. I mean, it really was just the golden mile of gay life there.
And at that stage, you left Taylor Square and you were going down Oxford Street and people were coming out of the bars. What was the atmosphere like?
Look, it was very light, very friendly. I mean, we'd had a big day. We'd done all the hard work at Paddington Town Hall in the afternoon. Everyone was looking forward to a fun night. Once the parade was over, we'd go to the pubs and have a drink and reminisce about it all.
Do you have any memory of what the numbers of people may have been?
Look, it started out, I think, several hundred, say 400 or 500. By the time we got down to the bottom of the street, it possibly, look, when you're in the parade, you don't really stand on the side and do a count. It was probably about 1,000 or so then. It's very hard to know. But when I got to the bottom of Oxford Street, I decided that I didn't really want to listen anymore to any stories about how late capitalism was a scourge of homosexuality, and once we had socialism in place, homosexuals would be living the life of heaven. Now, having read about Cuba and Russia, I knew that that definitely wasn't the case. So my friends and I, we just peeled off when we got down past Patch's nightclub and came over to the Exchange Hotel and settled in for a lovely night.
But when you were going down Oxford Street, there were obviously police with you. What was the attitude of the police? Did you feel threatened? Were they polite, civil?
I can't remember any police there on the march when we were going. There might have been a few up at Oxford Taylor Square when we started, but I can't remember any on the route down there. When we got down to the bottom of Oxford Street, you could see some of them over near Hyde Park, but we had no idea. I mean, certainly I wasn't aware of a police presence on the march down.
You mentioned music coming from the truck. Can you remember any of the songs?
The Tom Robinson band, I think Glad to Be Gay was some of them, but I can't remember all of them.
So what was the bar you went into?
I went into the Exchange Hotel. It was called the Saddle Tramps Bar then. It was faintly, vaguely leather. There were saddles scattered around the place. There was a DJ, a female, I can't remember her name, Maggie Burns, I think it was. And she, churned the music through, and we just sat around and had drinks. When
did you hear about the events of that night?
Look, it was probably the next afternoon, because I was a teacher and I had to go home and write a lecture on the Sunday, so that's what I was doing on the Sunday. And it was, I think, Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening, someone rang and said, "Do you know what happened?" And I said, "No." And so they explained all this, and I think there was something on the news, the telly or something like that, late news. And so then we all knew we had to go down to the courthouse in the bottom of Liverpool Street on the Monday morning.
And what happened?
Well, the police were lined up across there and we weren't allowed in. Only if you were one of the people who were to be charged. You'd been bailed, they'd been bailed and they were allowed in. They had to show them the bail notice and that they were the persons who had to go in. And the magistrate ordered the police to it's an open court. This is the Australian New South Wales judicial system. It's an open court. People must be let in. The police just ignored him. They just were lined up across the front and pushing people away. No one was allowed in.
Was it about 53 people that were arrested?
53 were arrested on the original night up at Oxford Street. I don't think any more were arrested the next day at the courthouse.
Was anybody... Well, people were obviously charged, but weren't most, if not all, the charges dropped?
Eventually they were. The magistrate said, there wasn't enough evidence, and he certainly implied it was police brutality that led to a lot of the resisting of arrest. So ultimately all the charges were thrown out, but the damage had already been done. The names had been released by the police, and names, addresses and occupations, and the Herald published them.
You took part in the parade, so you were a part of history, but you missed the rioting, you missed the police brutality. How do you feel about missing that? Are you relieved, or would you have liked to have been a part of it, or at least witnessed it?
Look, it really didn't matter to me. I mean, we'd been going since 1970 in various demos, and you had your little run-ins with the police over things like that. So I missed it, but it's just history.
How do you feel when you see the police marching in Mardi Gras now?
Somewhat taken aback. And even 2 years ago, or 1 year ago, last Mardi Gras, there was a case of police brutality against some young guy up at, I think, Oxford Square or somewhere like that. Part of the problem was they brought in police from the suburbs who hadn't been through a fairly rigorous training about you don't beat up poofters these days. But so Mardi Gras has just become utterly irrelevant in one way. I mean, banks have floats. I think there was a float from the Oral toothbrush company. It got a lot of jokes from the gay men, but Oral-B could be so many things. And all the old bike, the old Fred Niles head on a plate, Imelda's 1,000 shoes, and things like that, they're all gone. They're nothing like that anymore. So it's just more a festival rather than a commemorative thing.
So do you think it's lost its identity?
I think it's lost its bite. I think it's now much more a tourist-focused, money-raising thing. And it certainly keeps Sydney on the map. We're a global city, and it's one of the various things that keeps Sydney on the map.
What could it do? What could the current Mardi Gras organisers do to improve Mardi Gras and perhaps bring it back to its original roots?
I would hope that there's no censorship if some of the floats become a bit risque. A float with Corey Bernardi and Erica Betts holding hands and saying we're in support of gay marriage, we can't wait for us. Things like that. But the Mardi Gras is very cautious about having offensive things. And yet once upon a time, the whole point of it was to offend a sensibility which was so boring.
Obviously, you were not part of the violence of that night, the police brutality, as you'd gone into a bar. But how do you feel about an official New South Wales government apology? Does it go far enough, or is it more than welcome?
It's more than welcome. I mean, about time would be my attitude. The Herald apologised. In a funny way, in the 1970s, the Herald didn't really like talking about homosexuality, and the Australian was the most progressive newspaper, and they ran all the articles very favourably on homosexuality, on camp, on the first Mardi Gras and things like that. There are many more things for which an apology wouldn't hurt. One of the things is all those gay murders on beats from the 70s through to the 90s, and ACON's compiling statistics, and there could be anywhere between 50 and 80 of those. So something like that, an apology, I don't think the police are ever going to apologise. But there are things in the past that it wouldn't hurt to have an apology for.
That was my next question. Would you like a police apology?
If it was sincere. What's the purpose of an apology? If people apologise when they get caught doing something, it's not like an apology which is from the heart about, well, this really was very silly of what we were doing, or very bad what we were doing. So it depends how much or how sincere the apology is.
Back in the 70s, one of the messages from protesters and people parading was about liberty and being free. How does that contrast or go hand in hand with equality, liberation?
Well, equality, I mean, I was never a fan of marriage. I think many of us in the 70s thought religion, we're a secular state. We don't want anything to do with religion. Religion shouldn't pay any part in the laws of our country. So equality by marriage, yes, from a sort of equality civil libertarian point of view is okay. It's just we went down the wrong path as far as I'm concerned. Civil registrations, same as France has. Then if you want to go and have someone throw rice or confetti over you, it's up to you. But liberty, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and we should never presume that you never can go back.
Do you think that's one of the problems? Because of course you've just released your book, Gay Sydney, A History, and you actually talk about that you worry that the young today take a lot of what they have for granted, and if we don't remain vigilant, we could indeed go back to those days of suppression and repression. How significant do you think that is?
Well, I think one good indicator is that 20-something countries around the world have got same-sex marriage. We haven't, and they're adamant against it. We're going to have a plebiscite, and the politicians aren't even going to be bound by a plebiscite. We've changed prime ministers. The current prime minister's just following the same policies on same-sex marriage and things like that. So I'm not all that impressed by something like that.
Obviously, the Mardi Gras was a very significant event in Sydney. In terms of Australia as a whole, how significant a role do you think it has played?
Look, I think it certainly highlighted the high level of activism here. But going back all through the 70s, Sydney's gain was the loss for many other cities, because young activists in Adelaide or Perth or Brisbane thought, Sydney's the place I should go to. This is where I can live a better life. This is where I can contribute something. But it certainly repercussed, I mean, the amount of publicity it got. And it wasn't only the gay world, it was very much civil libertarians, people who believed in justice, who took up the running after that simply because of how the police had behaved here. So suddenly it wasn't just a gay issue, it was a civil liberties issue all around Australia.
And am I right in thinking that the Sydney Morning Herald published the names, addresses, occupations, ages, I think even photos possibly, of those who were arrested at that first Mardi Gras? Yeah,
they certainly published names, addresses, occupations, and I'm not sure they all the photos, because there were photos from pardon me, up at the cross. Nowadays, the Australian is just, the worst rag. The Murdoch press is just terrible, whereas the Herald is seen as, the new voice of the left, or whatever it calls itself.
What do you think the future holds for Mardi Gras?
Look, I think it'll probably continue on as a major festival. I think it was about a couple of years ago, the Mardi Gras board even tried to change the name to Sydney Mardi Gras, get rid of the gay and lesbian.
2011.
2011, was that when it was? And I mean, that was a sort of indication of where they wanted to go. Rio's got its Mardi Gras, other places have got their festivals. Let's de-gayify the Mardi Gras and keep it as a major Sydney festival. It's far better than, you know, the Sydney festival that goes before. It's far bigger than Moomba, which is in Melbourne. It's far bigger than anything else. It's got marketability, and I think that's what will happen. There will always be a gay element in it, but when the 78ers die off and the Dykes on Bikes die off, and will it have a gay connotation at all?
Garry, thank you very much.